Hello, I'm Simon. I'm a tutor for Models of Computation, Comp 2022, and a few of my students last week were having a few questions about L-DIAG being not Turing recognizable, and sort of not just the proof, but sort of where the idea comes from and what it means and so on. So I thought I'd just make a little quick video going over the idea and not super detailed about the concept, but more the overarching theme and where it comes from. So we're thinking about L-DIAG, not Turing recognizable. L-DIAG is this language. It is the set of encodings of Turing machines where the Turing machine does not accept its own encoding. And this seems interesting, seems like it's referring to Turing machines and whether they accept themselves and L-DIAG. It seems like it could be something worth investigating, but it's not entirely clear where the idea of this comes from. So to begin, I'll just sort of talk a little bit about logic and models of logic and computation as an intro. The idea of a system of logic is to represent truth and to represent, statements and make deductions from them. The English language is certainly an interesting model of logic to begin with. You can say things interesting in the English language. For instance, this statement is true. This is a statement within the English language which refers to itself. So if I assume that this statement is true, what the statement tells me is that it is indeed true. And if I assume it's false, what it tells me is that, yes, well, if I'm wrong, then when I'm saying I'm true, I'm wrong, which means I'm actually false, which is good. It kind of affirms itself in whatever occurs. So this is an interesting statement to think about in terms of a system of logic, a statement referring to itself, but it doesn't really cause any problems. It's not clear if this is actually true or false, if it can have a value in a system of logic, but we don't have a particular problem with it. On the flip side, if we look at this statement is false, I'm sure you've all heard of this one, it contradicts itself. So if the statement were true, that would tell me that it would have to be false. And if it's false, that would tell me that it would have to be true, which is obviously wrong. And of course, this really just demonstrates that English is not a rigorous system of logic. You can say things in English which don't really make sense. Of course, people have spent years trying to make systems of logic where you can only say things that make sense. I would argue that that's one of the key pursuits of studying logic, is how to make your syntactic rules cover the concept of truth. Of course, maths is a famous such system, but there is a paradox in maths known as Russell's paradox. And Russell's paradox is represented as a set. So it's a set phi, which is the set of sets that do not contain themselves. So if you've seen this before, it'll be very straightforward, but just to think about it for a minute, phi is, to start with, it's a very large set, okay? It'll have every set that doesn't contain itself. So it'll have the set containing 1, the set containing 2, the set containing 1 and 2. The set containing 1 contains 1, but it doesn't contain any sets, so it can't contain itself. You could have the set of all people in here, and so on. You could have a lot of sets, anything that doesn't contain itself. The problem comes when you ask yourself, does phi contain phi? So if we assume that phi is in phi, that would mean that phi is a set that does not contain itself. So that would mean that phi is not an element in phi, which of course is immediately a contradiction. And if phi is not in phi, then it must be a set that does contain itself. It must not meet this condition, which means this is an if and only if, interestingly. So if it's in the set, it's not in the set. If it's not in the set, it's in the set, which is obviously a problem. And in terms of maths, what this tells you is that the way we're thinking of sets in this situation is somehow not fully rigorous. It's not completely perfect, and it's possible to make statements about sets which are meaningless. Phi and phi, phi not in phi, you can't make any deductions about that. There's no axiom you could make that would decide this, because if your axiom was that phi is in phi, then that would immediately mean phi is not in phi. Big problem. So you might think, is it possible to have a rigorous, perfect system that does not have these contradictions? It turns out it's not. That's called Gödel's Incompleteness theorem. Look that up if you're interested. It turns out Gödel's Incompleteness theorem is equivalent to the halting problem, which we can reduce to, sorry, we can reduce this to something like that. Yes, I always get it mixed up. So L-DIAG is like a counterpart of phi in the system of Turing recognizable languages. So before we look straight at L-DIAG, let's first think for a second about what we know about languages. So we think of a language as a set of strings, say. So you've got strings, and they go into the language. And if a language is Turing recognizable, we think of it as the language of some machine, right? There's some machine which can run a process and recognize what strings are in it. And you sort of like, you know, it's not technically rigorous, but a lot of the time in tutorials, we tend to think of the machine as in some sense being equivalent to the language, which isn't true, but you know, it's useful to think of them in that way if they're Turing recognizable. And so machines, of course, we've discovered we can encode as strings, right? Which is interesting. In terms of DFAs, if this were a regular language, it could be represented by a DFA, but that DFA couldn't be encoded for another DFA to simulate. Before, if a DFA wanted to simulate one, you would have to like construct a new DFA. You can't have, there's no universal DFA that can recognize other DFAs as strings. This is unique to Turing machines. They are powerful enough to sort of simulate themselves and recognize themselves. And the issue here is that we end up with this kind of looping potential, right? If we think of a language as essentially being the machine that represents it, and a machine is essentially its encoding, which is a string, which is just an element of the language, we can think of a language as essentially being inside itself, which leads us to think of something like this, where we have languages that do not contain themselves. And as it turns out, that is precisely what L-DIAG is. So L-DIAG is the set of machines, the set of encodings of machines that do not accept their own encoding. So if we sort of think of language, encoding, and machine as loosely, vaguely being all the same thing, then this is the set of sets that do not contain themselves, which is exactly Russell's paradox. So if we want to like put this proof together rigorously, we'll sort of see why this is a little more interesting than Russell's paradox, and why we've actually gotten ourselves in a slightly better situation than all of mathematics. Say you want to prove that this is not recognizable. You would first assume that L-DIAG, I might just call it L for now, is Turing recognizable, right? That assumption would imply that there is a machine B, say, where the language of B is L. Yes, and now, of course, we're thinking of B as sort of being vaguely the same as the language. So we think, okay, is the encoding of B in L-DIAG? Well, if it's in L-DIAG, let's assume that would imply that, well, encoding of B would be in L-DIAG. That would mean the encoding represents a machine that does not accept its own encoding. So B does not accept encoding of B. But if B does not accept encoding of B, that means, you know, just by the definition of what the machine does, the encoding of B is not in the language of B. But is not in the language of B. Make that clear. But that would mean, based on our assumption, that the encoding of B is not in L-DIAG. So this should be the diag up here. Yes, which is obviously an immediate contradiction. And you can do this the other way as well. If, you know, the encoding of B is not in L-DIAG, that means B must be a machine that does accept itself, which means B is in the language, which means B is in L-DIAG, which is the same contradiction. So you can sort of see here that, like, the proof becomes slightly longer. It is more than just, you know, this immediately implies this. We have to go through two steps because we move through the motions. If we move through the representations that we're working with. So we go from thinking of it as a language to thinking of it as a machine to thinking of it as an encoding, and then thinking what that encoding must represent as a machine and what that must mean about the encoding, which must mean about the encoding in the language. So we sort of have to move through those layers, but we get the same result. We get the same looping contradiction. The key thing of interest here is that that doesn't mean in this situation that our entire system of sets and how we've defined them is broken. That the idea of a set is somehow wrong and we need to fix it, we need to patch it up. Because we've already gone to the effort of defining this very rigorously. And all this means is that this language is not Turing recognizable. That's the key result that we end up with. So Turing recognizable languages is sort of the level of computation, the model of computation you can reach before you end up with things that are very badly defined, immediately difficult to even reason about in useful ways. Yeah, so that's essentially all I wanted to talk over. As a quick recap, we started with, English and statements contradicting themselves, and then moved on to set theory, statements contradicting themselves, and then we talked about how languages, machines, encodings, and strings have this kind of looping potential, and how we can generate the same contradiction as this set theory thing. But that is okay ultimately, because if we just break this link by saying L not Turing recognizable, we no longer have this self-looping problem, this self-referentiality that leads to a contradiction. I hope that is useful and helps you understand things. Yes. Have a good day.